Hi, folks. Quick bit of backstory before you dive into this here episode. This is obviously the Halloween themed episode that I had intended for last year. But between arranging my theme song around this same time and the multitude of sleep deprivation issues, it was several weeks late, so I saved it and thought I would deal with it this year. And then my phone software crashed and I had to get a new one. Fortunately, though, the first three parts of this episode were saved. Specifically, the intro, the first part, and the second part, which means I'm gonna have to redo the Charmed episode. Heaven help me. Um, however, um, I'm grateful that I was able to bring this to you eventually. That being said, my opinions and views on the subject matter, particularly on the subject of Mab's relationship to the Morrigan, have changed thanks to my friend Drake over at Working Dragon Mystic recently, so that part I redact. Also, just as obviously, blanket disclaimer for the audio issues and for the stylistic differences in the way I recorded this. Um, I have, surprising both you and myself, actually improved in the time since this was originally recorded. And obviously, this was recorded just before I uploaded my channel intro. So, the parts that pertain to like time specific things and error specific things are, excused because of that reason. So yeah, without further ado, please enjoy this episode of A Mystic's Vlogs. It's making, but hey, if Halloween isn't a good enough time for resurrection, when is? And also, on that note, happy Halloween, everyone! Good evening, my audience, and happy Halloween! My name is Dalton Mortimer, I am the Authenticator, and this is the A Mystic Vlogs Halloween Spooktacular. By now, anyone who's seen my show on a regular basis has known the drill. When holidays roll around, I get into an excessively good mood, and usually there are 3-part specials that get released in accordance with whatever holiday that happens to be befalling us. And Halloween, of course, is no different. Halloween is, in fact, probably tied for my first place holiday with Christmas, at which I'm sure surprises no one who is in any way familiar with my work. But yeah, I've been away a long while basically because sleep deprivation is a son of a bitch, and waiting for my theme song, which you all hopefully just heard, to be arranged and then to edit it into something resembling a title sequence. Hopefully that goes over well and all is well. But the the fall is in full swing and the veils are parting. The black cats are hissing and the apple cider is peaking in its quality. So yeah, it's Halloween and we have a show to do. So without further ado, please enjoy this 3-part special wherein we will be discussing the mystical attributes of the movies Trick or Treat, Tales of Halloween, and Gasp Shock Horror. I am putting myself through the agony of reviewing an episode of Charmed for Halloween lore-related purposes, because much to the chagrin of, well, basically everyone, Charmed occasionally gets it right. And of course, I'm talking about the original Charmed. There is no force on heaven, earth, or anywhere else that can make me look at the new one. The shit I do for you people, I swear to fucking God. So, without further ado, let's see if we can use those dark powers of Halloween to resurrect my channel, eh? Because this is Halloween, this is Halloween, Halloween. Alright, so let's begin tonight's festivities with probably my favorite Halloween movie of all time. That being, of course, Michael Dougherty's Trick or Treat from 2007. This is my favorite Halloween movie, specifically because it does, well, basically what I would do in such a situation if someone asked me to make a Halloween movie. Namely, pack it to the brim with Halloween lore and make the moral of the story respect the lore, goddammit. The correct answer, as far as I'm concerned. And how? It's even a anthology, revolving around basically what amount to Halloween folk stories. This is a movie after my own heart, and if I had the powers of, the Dark One from Once Upon a Time, I might just rip out my heart and give it to the movie, because this movie is freaking awesome. But being as it's an anthology, and we already have our 3 stories for the evening tallied up, I'm going to have to tidy things up a bit and explain what I'm going to explain by basically going through the 3 stories each individually on their own terms first. And as with Krampus, which I covered last year for my Christmas special, I'm going to mostly use Trick or Treat as a springboard. Not because I don't want to sit here and geek out about Trick or Treat all night, but because we're on a bit of a schedule. As I'm recording this, it's already 6:11 at night, and I have things that I need to do of a ritual nature at some point this evening as well. So get on with it, as the Monty Python meme goes. Get on with it! Our movie follows several stories over the course of one, presumably modern at the time, Halloween night, and begins, well, ironically, or maybe not ironically given the subject matter of Halloween, at the end of one long Halloween night, where one person in a couple is still very gung-ho over the lore of Halloween and its awesomeness, and one is extremely, shall we say, nonplussed by it? Nonplussed is, I suppose, the best way of putting it. And as a result, she, despite apparently not having the energy to engage in Halloween shenanigans anymore, she tells her husband, proceeds to take down all of the Halloween decorations before the sun comes up. Because sometimes bitches die of their own accord, whether they intend to or not, play stupid games, win stupid prizes, etc. Meanwhile, the Halloween loving of the duo sneaks a peek at uh, the classic Charlie Brown special of, Great Pumpkin fame, and thus spares himself the wrath of a very angry, impish little fairy spirit that we will become extremely familiar with throughout the course of this movie. Although I could go on about all of the other Halloween stories, I only covered that one mostly because it's fairly short. Most of the time, the payload of these folk tales is to be found in one scene each, and I will use those scenes as my springboard for going off on longer Halloween rants, etc. The stories, apart from the one we've already covered, are as follows. One, in which the local high school principal decides essentially to get his purge on with Halloween as the framing device, out of respect for the holiday, and rid himself of some of the more annoying students which he has to deal with. One, in which a group of what appear to be slasher victims in the waiting, vis-a-vis this is a Halloween movie after all, actually managed to turn the table on their presumed, Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees analog by essentially revealing that they are in fact werewolves and that they are hunting suitors for the sake of satiating their own dark, twisted, animalistic desires. Lol. And one in which a nerdy, Velma-esque lover of Halloween gets placed on the business end of being the butt of a joke of a Halloween prank, and then they find themselves at the business end of Halloween's very supernaturally tinged sense of humor, while she gets spared because of her love of all things that go bump in the night, and so on and so forth. And then one, finally, where essentially it's a shortened version of the Scrooge story, but from a Halloween perspective rather than a Christmas one, where an old curmudgeonly dude who doesn't celebrate any of the Halloween things looks in vain for non-Halloween related content, which honestly probably would have spared his life many, many times over, and upon finding it, gets harassed by our favorite little imp, who I will be introducing throughout the course of my Halloween-related sidebar, and eventually manages to spare himself by virtue of the fact that, fortunately for him, he has a massive sweet tooth and enjoys selfishly hoarding Halloween candy, which then finds its way into the hands of said imp, and he ends up sparing himself basically a murder, a la the opening piece there. All in all, this movie is amazing. None of the descriptions I just gave it do it justice, because this movie is freaking awesome and hilarious. But, you didn't come here to watch the movie, you came to hear me go off on lore-based sidebars about the movie and its various, accuracies and inaccuracies. And in so doing, I will provide the, what you came here to see, hopefully. But, again, to paraphrase the Monty Python bit, I shall get on with it, shall I? Cutting out the fluff and getting down to brass tacks a little bit, each story essentially condenses its narrative payload down into one scene each in each story. However, only two of these directly come out and say what essentially amounts to the two halves of the thesis of the movie directly. The first half of this narrative thesis statement comes in the form of when the sociopathic high school principal is talking to one of his would-be victims, who has demonstrated a severe lack of respect for and downright hatred for Halloween, and he, being a relatively decent school principal, despite the psychopathy, or maybe because of it, knowing, how high school principals operate. That's a story for a different day, and my own scarring issues are not on the menu in this particular rant. Anyway, he explains to the young whippersnapper that Halloween is about a respect for the dead, because Halloween is the one night when the dead and all sorts of other things are capable to walk free among the living. More on my issues with this particular part of the statement later. And then the second half of the thesis statement comes in the form of the young, bookish, Velma-type girl essentially quoting the encyclopedia entry on Halloween when asked why she likes it so much, essentially. To which she references the festival called Samhain, the Celts, the veils being thin, and the possibility of human sacrifice, which I have an issue with because the Celts performing human sacrifices thing is mostly Roman propaganda. Because to the Celts, human sacrifice was essentially a last resort effort. It was essentially, our gods must be weak because we keep losing fights with these other tribes, so let us bolster their powers by offering up souls to them. But that's neither here nor there. And it is in offering the background of this two-part thesis statement of Trick or Treat that I shall come in and make my allegiances to the lore quite well known, and hopefully give an introduction to the childlike imp who has become the mascot of both this movie and, to a certain extent, Halloween itself. More on him in a bit. And without much further ado, in we go. But now, anyone who's a longtime fan of this show probably knows something analogous to the holiday-related drill around these parts. It begins in that shadowy transitionary period between the time where civilizations were hunter-gatherer civilizations and the time when they are agricultural civilizations, and long before the establishment of the Abrahamic religions. In this context, there was thought to be an overlap between the cycles of nature and the cycles of the metaphysical. And as such, traditions like holidays had a practical spiritual purpose, not just narrative or ornamental religious woo. And these alleged practical spiritual functions would often circumstantially overlap with things that had practical pragmatic functions as well. For example, nearly every culture that made that transition between hunter-gatherer and agrarian or agricultural had festivals revolving around both the harvest and the lowest point in the harvest. And it is in this context that we, in our search for broader Halloween traditions, need to look a little bit closer to home. Because despite the universality of these traditions, we, of course, are more heavily indebted to those that we have a greater societal sort of kinship with. Enter the ancient Celts once again. And if this sounds awfully familiar to my Christmas as a modern reinvention of various Yule traditions ramble from my Christmas special, it is because Halloween and Christmas, whether their names have been that or not, have always had an instrumental overlap with each other. They were essentially the light and dark mirrorings of each other, where traditions that led to Christmas led to the veneration of hearth home wholesomeness and sort of the more positive and nurturing aspects of both nature and human nature. That which would one day become Halloween venerates the primal, the primordial, and the whimsical, darker aspects of both human nature and nature itself. Which, of course, leads us into the festival that is mentioned by the young bookish woman in Trick or Treat. That being, of course, Samhain. Samhain was the time of year, according to the Celts, when the veils between worlds were at their thinnest, because, of course, all the living material that maintained that veil was in the process of dying. And as such, the darker aspects of the supernatural could bridge the gap between worlds and walk amongst the mundane and the living. Now, this is the one area where I have a slight bone to pick with Trick or Treat, because Trick or Treat, in both halves of their thesis statement, kind of overemphasize the dead. And while the veneration of and respect for the dead is certainly a part of Halloween and Samhain and all throughout the holiday's history, it's probably the least important aspect of it, in the sense that we're less worried about human entities because we know human entities and we are in some way comparable to those human entities. What's the main difference between a ghost and a human who is not a ghost? They have just, one has just shoved off their mortal coil, as it were, and the other has not. There's really not much of a power scaling difference between humans and ghosts, because we were each other at one point or other. However, the Celts also had a nature-based religion and a horizontally facing spiritual worldview. They were more concerned about the nature spirits that we would now refer to as fairies coming over across the veil. And it was to appease these kinds of entities that the traditions of Samhain or Samhain were created in order to appease, respect, honor, and hopefully befriend these creatures. Because essentially the logic goes, you don't need to be afraid of what's in the dark if what's in the dark likes you and is your friend, put simply. As a result, Samhain frequently featured lots of rabble-rousing because humans were considered a part of nature, and if nature was flaunting its darker aspects, it followed that humans also had an excuse to flaunt their darker aspects. Hence why so much of the Halloween imagery is dark in nature. As to the specific traditions, where it does diverge significantly from what would one day become known as Christmas, the traditions of Halloween are mostly meant to, or the traditions that we would one day adopt as Halloween are essentially the original protective and the placative measures that people would go to in order to protect themselves, both by befriending these entities and also by deterring them whenever possible. For example, the famous, or rather the examples given in Trick or Treat include the creation of jack-o'-lanterns, the dressing up in costumes, and the handing out of candy. And I shall address each of these summarily because it's just easier to do it that way, and it allows me to go into slightly more detail without incessantly rambling for too long. I do respect your guys' time, despite my tendency to ramble a bit. Sorry. Lol. Beginning, I guess, with the obvious, the costumes and the candy, these are remnants of the ancient process of leaving offerings for spirits. Essentially, as a harvest festival, you would leave the best of your harvest, or some of the cream of the crop, as it were, in a clearing in a massive wooded grove where it was thought that the spirits would congregate and dwell, and you would essentially leave requests, prayers, and etc. With these offerings in the hopes that not only would these spirits be satiated, but they would also be disposed to being helpful. As to where costumes and, trick-or-treating fall into this, there are one or two theories. Theory number one, the costumes were an affectation of protection, i.e., if the spirits thought you were one of them or they thought you were honoring them, they would be less likely to do all sorts of maniacal shenanigans to you. And therefore was considered auspicious to wear a costume of what you thought one of these spirits looked like. Option 2 is slightly more pernicious and kind of puts the blame on the humans once again because we're kind of fuck-ups. Option 2 is people would dress as these spirits in order to pilfer the offering sites because all the best shit was being offered to the spirits and it was going to go quote-unquote to waste if no one pilfered from it. Probably, in my opinion, a little bit of both. It probably started as a protective measure, and then a bunch of idiots thought, hey, we can take advantage of this herder because humans are not that bright. Put simply. Fucking hell. And so it was for thousands of years until at last the Romans came a-calling, having only recently just converted to Christianity, and promptly wishing to convert literally every other fucker on the planet. And because they were the Roman Empire, this was a plausible task. Unfortunately for the Romans, though, people grow quite fond of their holidays, considering that is when they are allowed to be most free and essentially engage in all of the primal hedonism that they want. So, when faced with, you need to stop celebrating Samhain, the Celts essentially told the Romans to get fucked. Fortunately for the Romans, and for wider Halloween history, though, they found a way around this, which was essentially let them keep celebrating the same traditions, but change the mythological framework ever so slightly to put it in a Christian religious framework instead of a pre-Christian spiritual framework. And as a result, eventually, Samhain was transformed into a day marking the day before All Saints' Day, or All Hallows' Day. Hence, All Hallows' Eve was born. It featured most of the same traditions, just with a Christian spin on things. Instead of fairies and nature spirits, now the marauding vagabonds of All Hallows' Eve were witches, devils, and the like. Well, maybe with a little bit of fairy lore still intact, because of course the English did not entirely forego fairy lore, because we, still have it and shit. But anyway, as how this pertains to the good old standby of what would one day become known as trick-or-treating, well, the framework we just went over there evolved eventually into a pastime whereby beggars, children, and poor people would go from house to house, essentially asking for a little bit of the offering before it was made to sort of engage in community building and shit. And this eventually evolved under the auspices of All Hallows' Eve into a practice called souling. Essentially, because this is where Halloween gets most of its overt preoccupation with death, it became sort of folklore wisdom that the dead were marauding around the countryside around All Hallows' Eve. And so poor people would go from house to house begging for what were known as soul cakes, which were these little sort of pastries that were made out of saffron and currants to pray for the souls trapped in purgatory in the hopes that eventually, rather than becoming marauding phantoms and ghosts, they would ascend to heaven or positive afterlife and leave everyone the fuck alone. And while the practice saw a bit of a break in between about the 19th century through the early 20th century, because the Protestant Reformation basically saw Samhain or All Hallows Eve as a pagan throwback and wanted nothing to do with it, much in the same way as they outlawed Christmas at one point. Yes, Christians outlawed Christmas, so next time someone bitches at you for more war on Christmas, just remind them that they did it first because it wasn't apparently Christian enough once upon a time. Anyway, different rant for a different holiday. Eventually, Halloween sort of devolved into its rambunctious, hedonistic roots, and it became known as Trick Night, Prank Night, or Devil's Night from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, and around 1930, or thereabouts, they brought back the old traditions of souling in a new form, in the form of trick-or-treating, i.e., people wouldn't come to your house and ransack it with tricks if they were bribed with candy and sweets and offerings and shit. So that essentially brought back trick-or-treating as a custom, and eventually, of course, the commercial capitalistic enterprises got in on the act because, if people are going to be buying sweets and baking good ingredients anyway, why don't we make a quick buck off of mass-producing candy and making costumes commercially and shit? And thus, the sort of modern tradition of Halloween ensued as we currently have it, with kids going from house to house in costumes, begging for treats as a means to prevent them from doing all sorts of hedonistic rambunctiousness. And of course, the hedonistic rambunctiousness evolved eventually into Halloween's horror fixation, and all is once again right with the world. As for what has become the sort of default emblem of All Hallows Eve / Halloween / Samhain, namely the jack-o'-lantern, that probably is going to require some creative quasi-anthropology, because the earliest rendition of the jack-o'-lantern story that we have is one that has very clearly been passed through the Christianized filter, even though it does clearly have roots from sort of pre-Abrahamic religions. But if we look hard enough, we can tie it back into sort of the original strain of Samhain or Samhain. See, as part of their celebrations, in the dark of the night on Samhain or Samhain, the Celts would have massive ceremonial bonfires in which various herbs and things were thrown into to sort of act as proto-incense and therefore sort of sanctify the fire in a holy manner. Now, these fires would then be used, because they were large enough to be relatively self-sustaining, to prop up smaller fires in sacred sites and homes all throughout the British Isles. And it was even common practice for people who were traveling on Samhain to carry with them embers from the heart of these sacred fires. Often in small little turnip-based lanterns, which, of course, were sort of the proto-jack-o'-lanterns. Now, as I said, the earliest sort of tie-in to jack-o'-lanterns with this is an old Irish semi-Christianized folk story, the story of Stingy Jack or Jack-o'-lantern, depending upon the name of the story you're going with. Long the story short, there was a guy named Jack. He was an asshole. He was such an asshole that he even managed to trick the devil a few times. The devil got pissed at him, basically kicked him out of hell, and said that he would never be eligible to be taken into hell, even though he was such a bastard. Obviously, heaven didn't want him because he was a bastard, and so he was condemned to wander the earth from here to creation, basically. And he lit his way with a turnip light, which he carved a face into, because long story short, he died by having someone who he pissed off cut his head off, because, that's how that works. Um, but just as he was about to begin his wanderings, the devil actually managed to take pity on him for 5 seconds, and he offered him up an ember from hell to light his way throughout the centuries. And lo, Jack-o'-lantern was born. For the longest time, then, as a protective measure to ward off all of the evil shit that Samhain or Samhain could throw at people, they would carve faces into turnips, light them, and essentially try to scare off all the dark and spooky shit by creating darker and spookier faces that they wouldn't even want to mess with. And eventually, when the Irish and the Germans and the Scandinavians, the ones that kept alive the jack-o'-lantern tradition, found their way over to the United States, and the Native Americans already had a sacred sort of gourd fruit thing in the form of the pumpkin, it only made sense to carve the jack-o'-lanterns of the New World out of pumpkins, and funnily enough, these were orange, and the orange and black motif of the glowing jack-o'-lantern made of pumpkin against the background of, the dark fall night with all of its red and orange and brown coloration made a perfect talisman, essentially, and the jack-o'-lantern was born. So with that takes care of the, standard Halloween iconography and the sort of two-part thesis statement / moral of the movie. But what of the other segments, the ones that don't clobber you over the head with direct statements and whatnot? What of, for example, the slasher movie victims who kind of turn out to be the monsters that other people should be afraid of? Well, actually, that goes back pretty far as well. There's a tradition in sort of folklore referred to as the demon lover, usually some kind of vampiric incubus or succubus, and these were especially popular, or I guess they were revived in the Victorian era because repressed sexuality did a number on people's psychology. But yeah, that's not super uncommon. I mean, it's fairly uncommon among horror tropes because usually we prefer to see women as the vessels of purity and, virginal and youthful innocence and so on and so forth. But yeah, and as far as them all being, werewolves and monsters and shit, that also, oddly enough, isn't much of a modern invention. In fact, one of the earliest werewolf stories we have, that goes all the way back to ancient Rome, and possibly even further back than that, is the story of a she-wolf. Basically, a Roman soldier went off to war, and he found himself in the midst of a battle in the middle of a dark forest with a she-wolf, and he managed to escape her, and take her paw. He put it in a box to sort of as a commemorative token of what he had managed to do, and then the next morning, once the light of the full moon had dissipated, wouldn't you know, it turns out that he has a woman's hand in a box, and it also turns out that the wolf in question died from her wounds, and so, it turns out, did a Roman legionnaire's wife at around the same time. And in fact, one of the earliest werewolf stories in general is a story given to us by Herodotus, the story of, I believe it was the Lemurians who sort of pissed off the moon god, and the moon god retaliated by fucking with them, by turning them into wolves with the intelligence of human beings. So there's that. As to the human suits, that's obviously a bit of a modern invention, but of course, shapeshifting is not uncommon in these kinds of stories. Neither is glamoring, which is essentially creating a energetic image of something and essentially fucking with someone's perception rather than actual metamorphizing. So yeah, there's that, and of course, there's only one major aspect of trick or treat lore we have left to go into, and yes, I did intentionally save him for last. That being, of course, young Master Samhain. Or I guess I shouldn't say young, considering it's implied in both the movie and the comics. There are Trick or Treat comics, by the way. They're fucking awesome. Read them. They are good. They are extremely good. They're all anthologies, and it's pretty freaking great. But yeah, apparently there is a goblin in the Trick or Treat universe who is the living embodiment of the spirit of Halloween, and he goes by Sam, which I find particularly funny because, of course, while the initial Celtic pronunciation, as far as we have it, for the day that Halloween is based on, is Samhain, because of the weird way English and Celtic sort of translate one another, the actual spelling of Samhain is Samhain, i.e. Samhain. So, him being named Sam, probably Sam Hain, is extremely funny to me. But yeah, in the course of the movie, he's basically what you could refer to as a goblin, or just a more diminutive fairy, almost sort of like a hobgoblin even. And as far as how he looks and all that jazz, it's no coincidence either, because of course the Celts, when they couldn't make it to a holy site or a site that was said to be a weak point between the veils, they would often create effigies of their gods that resembled very strongly what we now refer to as scarecrows. And in fact, some of the lore of the scarecrow is probably straw effigies that we created to guard our fields and shit from predators and crows and all that sort of thing. Essentially evoking the protection of a minor nature deity in order to protect our crops, essentially, was the gist there. So, yeah, even Sam is not entirely unreasonable, although obviously there were many gods of Samhain or Samhain, and incidentally, even sort of the coalescing of gods into a more simplistic being is not uncommon. There's a term in the occult we use called an egregore, which is essentially if you can compress bits and pieces of various entities into one cohesive entity, they become an aggregated, hence the term egregore, entity of those qualities. So you could say very well that Samhain is the aggregated essence of all of the Samhain deities. Although most commonly, the deity that was most heavily associated with Samhain was a entity referred to as the Morgan. Not just Morgan. She apparently got very pissed off with you if you misplaced her definitive article. She was the god, the Celtic god of sorcery and darkness and prophecy. And she would come out from the other world on Samhain and go trooping about with the fairies that were under her control. When Christianity co-opted the Morgan, it happened in two ways. Obviously, for anyone that's been paying attention, it won't surprise you that Morgan, the fairy, is a origin for the not Lovecraftian, Arthurian character of Morgana Le Fay in the Arthurian mythos. And of course, also, many of her sort of darker regal aspects were projected or perhaps inherited by Queen Mab, although in most circumstances it's considered that Queen Mab is simply a underling of the Morgan, and she essentially rules over the dark fairies that the Morgan rules over as a goddess, and I guess even fairies are subservient to other deities, at least in the Celtic pantheon. So yeah, there's that. Um, and of course, later on, what wasn't translated into a fairy was translated into a demon because of Christianity. But, what can you do? But yeah, that just about covers all of the trick or treat related lore that I have or feel the need to go into. Um, I do. Although I guess we could go into Sam's character a little bit because I find it interesting that most of the time, before he shows up to wreak unholy fairy vengeance upon the people that he seeks vengeance upon, he always seems to give them a chance because it always seems like reality bends to give them a chance to venerate some Halloween shit. Um, like in the case of what essentially amounts to the Halloween Scrooge at the end there, while he's flipping through the TV, dozens upon dozens of Halloween specials are showing up, and it's played off very comedically. And I don't think that's entirely unreasonable. And then of course again, when he turns off his TV or he gets fed up with it, he goes outside and finds his porch decorated with all sorts of protective jack-o'-lanterns and shit. And it's only after he further disgraces these that Sam shows up and puts a face to the forces you shouldn't meddle with. Um, it's worth knowing that fairies, while they might not be moral by our standards, they do have a logic to them, and as long as they give you a chance, it's one thing. It's worth noting that even in, like, the Grimm fairy tales, for example, yes, fairy punishments might be particularly severe by human standards, and their logic may be very different from human logic, kind of in the same way that a plant's logic is probably significantly different than a mammal logic, which is interesting because fairies are traditionally seen as nature spirits. But they will very often give you fair warning. Of course, there are assholes and dickheads all over every spiritual plane, if any of them exist. So like I'm sure there are some fairies who will not play by any sort of fair rules or give you any kind of fair warning. But usually in these kinds of stories, you get given fair warning and even maybe a few different opportunities, and only when you become an unreasonable dickhead do they retaliate in kind. And because their logic is slightly different than ours, their punishments may be ultimately more severe than ours. But even in the case of Sam in Trick or Treat, even as he is in the process of killing the requisite Halloween Scrooge, he does eventually stop and fuck off when his criteria have been met. His criteria, of course, being one of the bases of Halloween. So, yeah, that's a rule to go by, I suppose, with fairies. Don't be a complete dickhead to them, and at least let them tell you where you're going wrong, and see if that goes anywhere. Um, but yeah, that's the end of Trick or Treat, I suppose. Then, and again, I really really fucking love this movie. It's my favorite Halloween based thing, specifically because it is so lore heavy and has the ultimate message of just respect the lore, goddammit, know what you're doing and don't be a dickhead. Um, so yeah, there is that, and of course, Trick or Treat itself was quite a popular phenomena because I don't think I'm alone in my Halloween geekery. So there's that. So much so, in fact, that Trick or Treat inspired many other horror anthologies, some with somewhat mixed results, and it went so far as to even inspire our next source of Halloween jiggery pokery. That being, of course, the 2015 movie Tales of Halloween, which many critics said is the best comedic horror anthology since Trick or Treat. And to that I have to say, I I'm afraid, will be the judge of that. And with that, I suppose, on we move to the tales of Halloween, tales of Halloween, 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 Halloween. Alright, let's do this thing. Next on the docket, we have the 2015 movie, The Tales of Halloween. And I'm gonna level with you guys. I have extremely mixed feelings on this one. For one thing, they directly advertised it as basically the next Trick or Treat, and being as that's my favorite Halloween movie, I'm going to be judging it rather harshly on that basis. For one thing, they got a bunch of different directors to basically do a Halloween anthology, with each director directing an individual segment of said anthology, and that's fine and all, but yeah, Michael Dougherty did 3 or 4 or 5 segments himself, and most of them were better than the one presented here. Furthermore, like, 2/3 of them aren't even supernaturally based, which I suppose is fine for entertainment purposes, because I know a lot of people like slashers and shit, but for someone who's interested in covering this as an exploration of Halloween lore, it kind of fucks me over, especially because I tried to cover all of the segments anyway, and that's what took me so long to even make this, was I tried to cover all 10 or 11 segments of this fucking thing, and only 3 of them are even mystically worthwhile to talk about. So there's that. And most of the segments weren't nearly as enjoyable as Trick or Treat. So if your intention, sirs and madams, was to make a Trick or Treat the next level sort of version for 2015, you failed. You still haven't even begun to touch. You still haven't even begun to touch what Michael Dougherty managed to do by himself, basically on a shoestring budget. So, sorries, but not really. Okay, for one thing, this movie starts out with a sort of pop-up book title sequence with lots of Halloween atmosphere and some spooky Halloween sort of voiceover radio, and I don't know why there's always been something interesting and sort of automatically atmospheric about radio, and of course its associations with Halloween go back almost as far as the modern tradition of trick or treating. What with productions like Orson Welles doing his best rendition of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds as though it were an actual news broadcast, which of course famously promptly bit Orson on the ass, but so did most of his good ideas. So yeah, there's that. I'm stalling because there's really not much to talk about in this particular thing, and it annoys the crap out of me because I took the time to try and make all the segments work somehow in this, and I only got to use like 3 of the segments, and now it's the day before Thanksgiving, and I'm still fucking trying to record this shit. So, heh. But all in all, it is an enjoyable Halloween movie. It's just really not as good as Trick or Treat, and I'm annoyed that I don't have as much to talk about as I would like. But okay, let's get into it. I'm covering 3 of the segments, I believe. One which is called Sweet Tooth, one which is called actually I don't remember what the second one is called, but it's the one that features a devil essentially playing a trick on a kid, and another where some bullies get comeuppance via the spooky, manifestations of Halloween and shit. Those are the only 3 like supernaturally tinged ones, so that's fine, I guess. And it'll fulfill my obligations because I did promise in the opening that I was going to cover 3 segments in this, and I am an entity of my word. So there. And I pre-recorded that section, so I can't go back and edit it out without taking even longer. And so here we are. So without further ado, I guess, here is my take on 3 of the segments from 2015's Tales of Halloween. I'm sorry to bitch, but like I said, I'm running really behind on this, and it's really fucking annoying me. So yeah, onward and upward and getting this the fuck off my backward. So our first segment is called Sweet Tooth, which essentially features a kid who loves, Halloween and trick-or-treating and things and so forth, who's being babysat by... I don't actually know. I think it's his older sister and her boyfriend. Regardless, a babysitter and her boyfriend. They are a bunch of dicks who are eating his Halloween candy. He is understandably nonplussed by this, and they sort of excuse their bullshit behavior by telling him the folk legend or the urban legend of a candy-based demon named Sweet Tooth, who apparently was born out of a kid who was deprived candy on Halloween, a la Tim Burton's version of Willy Wonka from the good Willy Wonka movie. And yes, I dislike the Gene Wilder version. It's not accurate to the book. It doesn't use any of the songs. It's not a good movie, and Gene Wilder rubs me all the wrong way. That's neither here nor there. I have no patience for slightly more stable Will Ferrell and his shenanigans, which is basically what Gene Wilder always amounts to for me. Regardless, so they tell him this urban legend because, of course, how can you get through a good Halloween without, a folk legend? And that's all well and good. And I actually, this is probably by far well, actually, no. I liked all 3 of the segments that I'm covering here. It's just the ones that I didn't decide to cover that pissed me right the fuck off because there's more of them than there should be. But so they tell him the story about essentially how this kid named Timmy was deprived of candy again, a la the good Willy Wonka backstory from the good Willy Wonka movie. And then, he finds out that his parents are actually eating his Halloween candy while telling him that he shouldn't. He snaps and murders them because that's how Halloween stories go. And then he, I guess, evolves or manifests himself into a demon. And right here is where I'm going to start whining. Because, okay, I'm well aware that there are people in occult circles who genuinely do think that all spirits are essentially just ghosts. I find these people to be idiots, and most of their spiritual opinions are derived from needlessly postmodernly deconstructing actual spiritual beliefs and basically going subjective woo all over occultism. And as you can imagine, going subjective woo in relation to the occult really, really pisses me off as someone who has devoted 13 and a half years of his life to the occult and also regularly dabbles in philosophy and has made it his personal mission to kill subjectivity with a sword up the ass. Because subjectivity is essentially my Balrog. But that's neither here nor there. But yeah, I do not subscribe to the theory that it is possible for one kind of spiritual being to become another kind of spiritual being, at least not without extremely intricate magics and conversion spells, essentially, which we don't see any of here. It's just he kills his parents. Uh, he eats the candy that was in their stomachs, and this alone is able to convert him into some kind of demon. Why they didn't just stop at Vengeful Ghost is something we'll get into later, because I kind of have a theory, but in order to explain that theory, I kind of need to show the next few segments first, and then my theory will probably make more sense. But yeah, I get, for the sake of narrative purposes, they probably didn't want to just say Vengeful Ghost, and you could make the argument, I suppose, that the dark energies of the veil associated with Halloween sort of did the conversion spell for him, because, narrative convenience magic and all that jazz. But as a general rule, this movie has already pissed me off, and I'm not super inclined to being charitable, because you pretended to the throne of my favorite Halloween movie, and now you understand why that was a very, very bad idea for you to do. But anyway, so they tell him the story of this kid, and he, of course, at least kind of believes them, and so forth. And goody for him. And then, of course, despite the fact that we're fairly certain that the teens in question didn't actually believe in the story, and they just used essentially an old urban legend to spook this kid, as, asshole teenagers are wont to do to little kids, because fuck you reasons. Then the candy-based demon named Sweet Tooth actually shows up. He kills the asshole teenagers for being asshole teenagers, because, actually no, there's actual lore that I can go into with that. Generally speaking, when it came to pre-Abrahamic rituals, sex and the associated energies was usually a part of that sort of ritual. At least abstaining from it could be. In occult circles, it's essentially the idea that life energy takes multiple different forms or multiple different variants, and one of the strongest variants is the energy associated with the sex drive, or sort of the generative impulse. So in some rituals, it's a good idea to abstain from sexual activity in order to appease the entities you're evoking or invoking. And in some rituals, it's a good idea to essentially offer some of that vitality to the entities you're invoking for the sake of honoring them and so forth. So that might explain why in just about every horror movie, and in particular Halloween-based horror movies, fucking will fuck you up. To put it simply, do not fuck in a horror movie. You will die. Because it makes sense, because the idea is essentially the forces that you're playing with are essentially pissed off at you for trivializing them by essentially treating them as though they're irrelevant, and then fucking on what essentially amounts to their sacred sites and shit. Yeah. Once again, do not fuck in a horror movie. You will die. And you will probably deserve it, as we see here. Fortunately, though, our momentary protagonist figures out that if he offers the candy-based demon candy, it will fuck off. And obviously, this is an allusion to, placating the spirits of Halloween and Samhain and so forth with offerings, usually in the form of sweets, which evolved into trick-or-treating. I went over this once already in Trick or Treat, and it was done much better there. So I'm not gonna dwell too much on that. But yeah, there was at least stuff in this segment to talk about. So goody for them. Although most of this essentially was me bitching at them for getting something wrong. But that's what this show is for. I bitch at you for getting things wrong when it comes to magic, and I applaud you for getting things right when it comes to magic, when it's something pop culture or media related. So, There is your Dalton gets pissed at something inaccurate and whines about it for about 10 minutes segment of the Halloween special. Yay you! If that's what you come here for, then you, sir or madam, have a relative feast of that to engorge yourself on. And I'm not gonna be super negative because this is still a Halloween special, and like the last dregs of my Halloween based joy are still in some kind of force. So I'm just gonna leave it there, and we're going to move to the next segment, which I'm gonna have to look up because I still don't fucking remember the title, and I'm not gonna edit this too much because again I'm late and I'm pissed, so fuck it. Okie dokie. After a quick consultation with the Googles, it reveals that the second trepidatious tale on this trio of terrible tales is called The Night Billy Raised Hell, and it follows the titular Billy as he is hoodwinked into harassing a local neighborhood curmudgeon by a bunch of his friends, and said curmudgeon, shall we say, not taking it well when Billy is caught. Unfortunately, however, for Billy, said curmudgeon is not a mortal man as we assume him to be. It is a demon by the name of Abaddon. He's only called the devil most of the time by the characters, but the name he chooses while going incognito among the humans is Mr. Abaddon, and I am well versed enough in demonology to know that ain't no fucking coincidence. Capiche? So yeah. On that note, I guess that there's a few ways we can go at this. Way number one is to actually look into the demonology of Abaddon, which I am more than willing to do. But way number two is to, as I said earlier, present my theory. See, unlike Trick or Treat, which had a decidedly pre-Abrahamic way of going about its mythology, i.e., Sam had been around for many, many, many thousands of years before Christianity or even, Judaism were a thing, and we are aware of this, and we are regularly made aware of the sort of European, particularly Celtic roots of Samhain or Halloween. Tales of Halloween occupies sort of that gray area between the sort of modern secularized version of Halloween and the medieval notion of the Devil's Night, since most of its supernatural entities are either ghosts or they're demons, or in the case of Sweet Tooth, as we saw previously, some weird bastardized mishmason version of the two, which, I already expressed my issues with. Moving on. So yeah, that's ultimately my theory. My theory is, while Trick or Treat was very much rooted in the ancient past of Samhain or Halloween, this Halloween Tales shenanigans feature mostly among the Devil's Night sort of oeuvre. And in that same regard, Mr. Abaddon, when catching Billy out for doing stupid prank shit to him while he's apparently on vacation amongst the mortals for Halloween, which, I guess a demon's gotta relax too sometimes. He conjures up a smaller devil, which takes the form of Billy in a devil's costume, which is kind of funny. And then they go and raise all kinds of hell, pun both intended and choreographed by the title, I would imagine. And then Billy takes the blame for it because this is your classic be careful what you wish for, comeuppance for messing with things you don't understand type story, and so on and so forth. As for the lore of the demon Abaddon, well, here's where things get a little bit interesting. See, Abaddon was a demon that was considered so powerful that not even Lucifer wanted or even could necessarily control him. He's referred to in medieval demonology as the angel of the bottomless pit. And funnily enough, in Jewish demonology, he wasn't even considered an entity for the most part until later in the period. Abaddon was considered to be a place, specifically the place that was sort of the canyonous gap between what we would call hell, or what the Jewish called Sheol, and what would later become known as purgatory. See, Abaddon was an angel that um, opted to take no sides in the fight between heaven and hell, and therefore was cast somewhere out of hell, or out of heaven, but not necessarily in hell. And as such, according to classical demonology, it was his job to sort of guard the gates of hell and prevent anyone who shouldn't have been there from being there in the first place. And being, as his name literally means, destroyer or destruction or oblivion, he would often swallow the souls of anyone trying to escape from hell before they could, make it across his ravine. So yeah, Abaddon is not the kind of being you want to fuck with, because he is a being that essentially takes no sides, and it's just a swollen Lovecraftian monstrosity of epic proportions. Yeah, this demon is probably as close to a Lovecraftian entity proper classical demonology gets, um, unless you go back so far as to be like Sumerian and shit. Um, any anyway, let's see, where can I go from there? Yeah, it's interesting to me that Abaddon of all demons would just decide, fuck this, I'm going to take a vacation amongst the mortals for a while, and he would pick a small, like, suburban town of all places. But then again, this demon is a demon who gives it approximately zero fucks. Although interestingly, he does apparently have um a tribe of demons that serve under him. Specifically, he is said to be the ruler of the seventh hierarchy, and also that his demons are demons that take the form of locusts, that are said to be as large as men, with bodies similar to horses, and with the faces of men. So, apparently he can summon up a giant ass swarm of motherfucking locusts if he so chooses. And there's some lore to suggest that it was that it was a favor from him that gave God the ability to give Moses the plague of locusts that he sent upon the Egyptians in the Old Testament. So, yeah, definitely not the kind of entity you want to fuck with. Especially not when they're on a vacation just trying to enjoy, presumably the veils being thin because Halloween. Uh, but yeah, anyway, let's wrap this up there because I don't really have anything more interesting to say about this story. I I do kind of like this story in the same kind of in the same kind of ironic way as all the Halloween comeuppance stories end up going. Um, and it's very interesting that they would literally go for a kind of literal translation of the whole Devil's Night shenanigans and the pranking and so forth. I also enjoy that, much like sort of medieval demonology, demons aren't just generic cackling entities. They have their own wants and desires. They just happen to be the kind of beings you don't want to fuck with. Because, well, demons. Anyway, let's move on to part 3, which is entitled The Weak and the Wicked. I'm glad I checked that title before recording the audio this time. Yay me, learning basic YouTube shit for once. Hiss, boo, hiss. Get on with it, etc. Alrighty, so the weak and the wicked. Yeah, this one's gonna be a fairly quick one. Long story short, kid gets bullied repeatedly by assholes. Assholes continue to be violent sociopaths on Halloween of all nights. Kid warns them that there's a legend about a demon who punishes the wicked where the wicked hurt the weak. They don't believe him. Giant ass motherfucking demon shows up, butchers them. Kid smiles, knowing that he now has a protector. All is well, basically. And this one wouldn't even necessarily be worth mentioning if it didn't feature a very obvious supernatural element, and also, this is the only story that I'm aware of that actually acknowledges that, people can summon these beings. Most of the time, where these kind of stories are concerned, everyone just kind of has this passive attitude towards supernatural entities, and no one actually applies themselves to, like, learning anything about them. But apparently, this kid knew enough to A, draw a picture of a demon, presumably out of some grimoire somewhere, and B, carry around with him the spell necessary to summon the damn thing. Heh, damn thing. I punned without even realizing I was punning. God damn it. And, there it goes again. I'm gonna stop this now before it turns into a spiral of goddamned puns. Literally. Fuck. Um, but yeah. Um, though that being said, I have absolutely no idea where they got the demon that they summoned here. I'm assuming it's just made up for plot convenience's sake, because I have read the Solomatic Grimoires, I have read the Pseudodemonitia Demonium, I have read several other grimoires on demonology, and not a one resembles the one they conjure here. But that being said, it's still an interesting, like, comeuppance-based Halloween story, so there's that. It might be my favorite just because it shows a occult-based nerd uh, forcing comeuppance on people who are dicks to him. And there are reasons why I would find that compelling, because, me. Um, but yeah, aside from that, this movie is enjoyable but skippable, honestly. Like, comparing it to Trick or Treat is just like comparing your average, like, c- comparing a Model T to a fine Italian sports car. I enjoy Model Ts. They have a quaint sort of historical flair about them, but if I had my choice, I'm a going with the Bugatti Veyron. And Trick or Treat is the Bugatti Veyron of Halloween-based lore movies. So to slap a "this is the next Trick or Treat" on what is the Model T of Halloween-based lore movies is kind of fucking insulting, and I resent it entirely for doing that. But anyway, so now let's talk about the elephant in the room, or should I say the three elephants in the room. That's right. I've tarried long enough. It's time to address Charmed. Uh, uh. Okay, so for those of you who are paying attention to the addendum or prologue at the beginning of this episode that I inserted before the title sequence played, you know that this section of the video is being recorded a year after the other two or three parts of this video were, so my apologies if it's slightly disjointed. My apologies also because I'm gonna have to talk about Charmed, and that's not going to enthuse me on the best of days. But I promised I would talk about Charmed, I promised I would do the Halloween episode of Charmed, so we're doing the Halloween episode of Charmed, and I'm gonna talk about Charmed. And you are all free to kill me now and save us all the trouble if you like. But barring that, I'm gonna have to be a man of my word. Anyway, so let's talk about sort of the weird niche that is Charmed. Charmed is so very campy. Like, take every cliche show that has ever targeted itself at like middle class to upper middle class housewives and career women and add a dash of Buffy, a dash of the 90s Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and like the very beginnings of like the most light-hearted fluffy bunny Wicca slash neo-paganism slash new age you can find. Stick that all in a blender, and eventually you'll have Charmed. Um, it's I'll say this for old Charmed, it was at least fun and mostly self-aware at times. Um, the writing was bad because it was basically a soap opera without the melodrama for the most part, and that, went about as well as you can expect. But because I'm supposed to be the mystical accuracy guy in these parts, I will say that occasionally Charmed got shit right, and by occasionally I mean very, very rarely. Like, the Gypsy episode was good, the Muse episode was alright, um, this episode is probably the highest watermark that Charmed ever hits in terms of attempting to actually be accurate about anything ever. Um, the characters are hilarious in their awfulness, and if you want a more sort of in-depth examination of that, I highly recommend that you check out the YouTuber Obscura Slupa. Well, YouTuber and content creator, because she's not exclusively on YouTube. But yeah, Obscura Slupa did an entire like many hours long breakdown of Charmed and all of its hilarious, cliche, awful kitschness, and highly recommend that. If you think I'm being mean to the Charmed ones, then you need to go and watch some Obscura Slupa because she is hilariously snide to them, and they deserve it. So yay, cross promotion done. Obscura Slupa is awesome. Go and check out her shit when you're done watching my shit, preferably, but whatever. And I guess I've stalled long enough. We need to get into the thing. So Charmed season 3 episode 4, the Halloween episode of Charmed, and probably its most accurate contribution to magic in media as a genre or subgenre. All Halliwell's Eve. And yes, that is a pun on the sisters' names. Please do not. Ah, God. Early 2000s, what the fuck was wrong with you and your pun names? Sigh. But anyway, let's get down to business because I am not wasting much more of my Halloween night on this. The plot, such as it is, which I will be skipping over through mightily because not much of this is actually relevant to anything, either inside or outside of this episode, begins with our witches preparing to go to a Halloween party, despite the fact that none of them apparently knows a goddamn thing about Halloween, leaving an opening for Phoebe to whine and bitch and moan about how witches are a horrible stereotype, even though she herself admits she knows nothing about what one is celebrating when one celebrates Halloween. And Piper, of course, declares that she is going to turn over a new leaf by dressing as the Good Witch of the North, which is a character development because if you know anything about Piper, you know she is as self-centered and type A as you can probably get in a main character in one of these fucking sitcoms. And it lasts all of 5 minutes because immediately when the plot gets going, she starts to complain about how she has a party to go to and she has decorations to put up, and basically every suburban mom's whining when shit like this happens, and so on. But anyway, long story short, after they basically set up the straw man to be corrected later for the sake of demonstrating that there's been character development even if there hasn't been, they get whisked away back through time by Charm's favorite deus ex machina, the elders, so that they can save the origin of their bloodline and thereby maintain the use of their powers for good and all that shit. Meanwhile, demons that they've already vanquished are coming back from the dead because the veils are thin, and apparently demons have their own specific afterlife, which is weird because you would think they would already be spiritual beings and therefore be kind of unkillable. But charmed logic, I guess, and so we move on. At any rate, we proceed to do the time warp again and wind up in 1670, where a baby is about to be born who is the head of their line, and if they don't do something to save the head of their line, who is the baby, they're going to either be evil or the powers won't exist. But because they're back in time, they have no access to their innate blood magic abilities, and therefore it sucks to be them, because despite them being witches being the entire premise of the show, in no time since discovering they were witches did they ever bother to, learn any skills or powers or knowledge in relation to witchcraft, and therefore what basically ends up being our wise old mentor for the evening has to school them in the ways of not being completely Mary Sue fuck ups and actually teaches them how magic actually, works and shit. And obviously, there's plenty of crossover between that and Halloween traditions, hence why we're here. And we get to my favorite scene of the episode, which is pretty much the only good scene, wherein the wise old mentor plays Q to the girl's James Bond, and we get, lore name dropped, some of which is accurate, some of which isn't, and we'll go through that scene, bit by bit as the lore becomes relevant. However, this only happens several scenes after the Charmed Ones get their asses handed to them on a silver platter again and again and again and again, because the Charmed Ones are, apparently, the worst witches in fictional history, or otherwise. Like, seriously, the mentor witch starts talking to them about the residual energy of Halloween and ley lines and veils and things, and they look at her like she's speaking a foreign language, and then they proceed to get knocked on their asses by a talisman that kept out, like, 10 other witches, while simultaneously saying, "Talismans don't pack nearly as much power where we come from, darling," as though they know anything when it's just been demonstrated to them that they know jack shit and nothing, and then they get knocked on their asses by a talisman, and then the mentor witch that brought them there literally starts going, "You guys are powerless frauds, I don't understand what went wrong with our spell, we asked for the most powerful witches ever to live," and it's played as a serious moment too, like it's supposed to be a really sad, emotional, come to witch equivalent of Jesus moment, and she just straight up calls them frauds. It's actually kind of hilarious if you know the Charmed Ones and you know just how on their high horse about their immeasurable powers and basically being female superheroes they are all the freaking time while not knowing a damn thing other than what other witches have written in their own spellbook. Lol. And yeah, I know it might seem like I'm being a little bit down on the Charmed Ones, especially considering the point of this episode appears to be they suck and they need to get better. But the thing is, for those of you who might now be saying, "Yes, Dalton, that's the joke," um, they never bring this up again. And it's never mentioned again, and none of what they learn at the end of this episode ever becomes relevant to any spells they cast in future. So, yeah, failure and character development amnesia. See, this wouldn't be a problem if this were the point of the episode. If the point of the episode was they suck and they need to learn shit the old fashioned way, I would be singing this episode's praises. But given that it basically comes to them naturally anyway, and it never becomes relevant to any other episode but this, and is forgotten in the very next episode, I'm gonna withhold my ability to be snarky. Thanks. But of course, they're the main characters, so the power of plot armor compels you, and she acquiesces to train them and give them actual useful tools and shit, and that's where we get this episode's payload. Finally. Jesus Christ. She starts with the witch's conical pointed hat, which she claims is meant to focus and channel energy in the same way I would describe an obelisk working if we were discussing something from ancient Egypt. I've looked all over. I can't find any corroborating evidence or even a corroborating theory that that was how that worked ever. So, yeah, I'm going to call bullshit on that. However, it is somewhat ambiguous as to what the witch's hat is actually derived from, so they're excused for at least thinking of a plausible magical rationale for it. And I could see someone making a hat specifically for that, so fair enough. As for the actual historical record, my money is on the idea that back in ye olden days, headgear and various other accessories often denoted someone's occupation or social standing, and the pointed conical hat was often the uh, professional attire of people who brewed alcohol in their homes. And very often, because it was a domestic chore, it was the women who did it. They were referred to occasionally as alewives or brewsters. And because the same women who knew how to brew things also might know things like folk remedies and alchemy, the wise women often were associated with the same. Not to mention the fact that the women who knew how to brew things and how to engage in herb lore and such were very often the same people, so it very often was the village wise woman who was also the local brewster, and therefore the iconography got intermingled. Next up, Poppets, her explanation of which is the only one that comes close to genuinely kind of ticking me off, in the sense that she claims it's a totem of the power of something something femininity, etc. And I'm just sat there like, why couldn't you have just said the obvious of effigy magic works sympathetically by binding whatever the thing is meant to represent to the icon, therefore energy can be passed through it in a mechanism similar to, say, a remote control, and whatever that remote control happens to be controlling. That would have been accurate, and it would have saved you a lot of trouble, especially considering we don't actually even see them use the poppets in this episode. I guess because there wasn't really a visual effects heavy moment where the power of abstract femininity could be brought to bear in some way weird and whatnot. So yeah, fail on poppets. Also, you don't think male folk magicians ever use poppets? Show, really? Um, it's not like there's famous examples of effigy magic used by men or anything. Cough, cough, the ancient golem myth or anything. Cough, but whatever. Then we get to the obvious one, the broom, which maybe it is because it is the obvious one that they actually get this one right for the most part. Essentially, a witch's broom has the same functionality as a wizard's staff, plus a little bit of extra protection mojo, because the thistles are usually made using birch wood, which is said to be highly protective. Fun fact, though, witches' brooms are almost always made of ash wood, because that is said to be the wood that is sacred in a way that lends itself specifically to witchcraft. Also, they actually get a simple warding rite with the broom, in which it is said that you're supposed to sweep only east to west, because that's supposed to ward off evil and whatnot. So, yay, Charmed actually got one. Huzzah! Let's see. Jack-o'-lanterns we've already covered, so I'm not going to cover it again because we've already covered it more thoroughly, more entertainingly, and better in previous segments. Other than that, there's just some generic herb lore. Yes, lavender is considered protective. Yes, sage is considered protective because it dilutes negative energy. Um, yes, apples are considered protective, not for the reasons they go through, though, mostly for the reason of it being associated with, nurturing knowledge, the beginning of life, and so on. I have heard there being a pentacle at the heart of an apple because of the way the seeds are arranged before. I've never heard it in the context of explaining why the apple is protective, though, so I'm going to discard that, and we're going to move on because I don't have all night, and I'd like to be able to enjoy my Halloween, and talking about Charmed does not an enjoyable Halloween make for me, so we are moving on for the sake of my sanity and faith in whatever I have a faith left in, honestly. Moving forward. And we're moving, and we're moving, and we're moving. Alright, rapid fire to the finish here. So, the villain has a Halloween-related soiree, or an All Hallows Eve soiree, and I'm not sure if that's appropriate for this point in colonial Virginia, because this was around the time the Puritans got a bug up their ass about, my paganism, and therefore banned Halloween and Christmas celebrations because they thought the Catholic Church was essentially inculcated by pagan practices and therefore wanted to shun them. But for the sake of getting this through, I'm just going to chalk it up to this was before um, Oliver Cromwell and Governor Bradford got all bitchy about it, and we'll move along. Or this noblewoman just didn't care, which, fine. So Phoebe sweeps away the talismans that previously had knocked them on their ass, and I'm left wondering if that was so easy, why didn't one of the more experienced ones just do that then? The ones that they didn't have to teach from scratch? And then they get the baby, but oh my god, the mother who's pregnant is giving birth right now, because of course she is. They go to a stone circle, they cast a protective circle that I can't believe they didn't know how to do already, and they get sent back to the past because shock of shocks, it's their ancestor, and then they one-shot the generic demons that had been tormenting the side characters for the entire episode, which is leaving me wondering why it was them and not one of the more powerful ones that got the power of resurrection all of a sudden. And then the episode is over, and my god, just Charmed. Why Charmed? Why even? Why Charmed? Ugh. And that, ladies and gentlemen, and assorted others, is my coverage of probably the most accurate, mystically speaking, episode of Charmed. And given that it's the most accurate one, and I still bitched and complained the whole way through, I'm sure you can begin to gauge why, while the gay part of me can enjoy Charmed in the campy Yas Queen sort of way, the mystical part of me cringes every time I think about it for more than 5 seconds. And also, consequently, since this is the end of my Charmed review, it is also the end of my three-part Halloween special for last year and consequently this year. I would do another one, but I'm running out of steam here, and I already have other plans that I've got to accomplish tonight, and not to mention actually getting this edited and uploaded eventually, so there is that as well. But don't let my snide tiredness and exasperation with Charmed fool you. I still love Halloween. It's tied with Christmas for my favorite holiday, and they're sort of dark mirrors of each other. The homespun light and the whimsical darkness. And I would encourage all of you to mind that darkness. But until next time we have to mine it, cheers, guys, and happy Halloween. Mind the veils, mind the dark, and I'll see you on the other side.